Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Radcast on the topic, A New Story for Humanity. This is the social club at the end of the world, and we're building off our previous recording, which was on refreezing the Arctic, where we zeroed in from the question, how do we get people's attention and focus on this so we can apply our collective intelligence to making all the transformations we need to make to refreeze the Arctic, and thus at least buy us some time to see what else we can do to save life on Earth. And what we zeroed in from that question onto the strategy of getting people's attention focused on the topic of organized crime. We start with toppling the criminal drug cartels, which we can do by transforming prohibition. Then we expand that to all forms of organized crime, including organized crimes against Mother Earth. We go after all these categories of organized crime simultaneously and holistically. And we're just talking about the various different facets of this strategy because this is the beginning of a new story for humanity. Humanity was on this tremendous descent, and now this is the beginning of us taking an off-ramp to a whole new place, a whole new direction. I want to welcome our guests. We've got Alex in Austin, Texas. We've got Dan in Chicago, Illinois, and we've got Michael in the south of France. Welcome, everyone, and going on mute.
This is Dan in Chicago. Good to be here and looking forward to productive discussion.
My name's Alex. I used to live in Seattle. I know Jamin lives in Seattle, where they legalized marijuana. And I think it's also, I know for Colorado, they had like a tax surplus. So didn't they actually give money back to the taxpayers from all the money from the tax from buying marijuana at an official government store in Colorado? So I don't know if the same thing is like in Portugal and Amsterdam where drugs are legalized, but I imagine there are great benefits. And I also know people have a big burden off of them because they feel they can go get help if they have even, I know in Portugal they legalized all drugs, or not legalized, but they made them, if you need help and want to go see a doctor, you can do that legally. You can go admit to a doctor you do meth. Anyway, thank you. Hello. That's it.
And I'm Michael. I'm also from Seattle, and I'm here in the south of France.
Wonderful. Great to see you all. And yeah, that was a great lead-in, Alex. What is really fascinating is that there is one country that I know of that has solved the drug problem and the drug cartel problem. And they've done it peacefully and compassionately, and that is Holland. And how did they do it? So they essentially legalized cannabis, legalized but regulated. And then secondly, what they did for the hardest and most addictive of drugs, heroin, was they created these government centers to support addicts. And so if you're a heroin addict, you can go to this center 3 times a day and, dose up on heroin provided by the government center itself. What effect did that have? That had 2 effects. Number one, the addicts no longer had to commit crimes to get money to buy heroin. And number 2, well, it had multiple effects, but 2 big ones. One is that, and so the crime rates plummeted. But number 2, I think more importantly, it completely changed the way heroin is perceived in Holland. From party drug, hey, got some heroin, let's go get high, to, oh, yeah, that's something that people get addicted to. And then they go to this government center and service their addiction. As a result, heroin usage among people under the age of 40 is practically non-existent now in Holland, whereas in the United States, it's been climbing. So Holland is a huge success of repealing and a case study in repealing prohibition and replacing it with something sensible. So we have definite pathways to and examples that we can follow, build upon, or roll our own solution to getting rid of criminal drug cartels. But the main point is it's possible. It's been proven possible. We can definitely do it. And if we can, we must. And it sets us on this trajectory of from there, from that base of eradicating criminal drug cartels, to eradicate all forms of organized crime, including organized crimes against Mother Earth herself. I mean, that's the big coup that we're going towards. But you first have to rally the people. You have to get the people united and active behind a program, a strategy, you know, a leadership, a movement. And that's what we're doing here. So with those loquacious words, I'm going to go on mute and love to hear everyone's thoughts.
Yeah. So if we look at the drug problem, it's very complex because there's different interests that are in favor of keeping drugs illegal, and then there's a set of interests about, you know, decriminalizing drugs or legalizing drugs. And I think it's important here to be able to connect the dots that exist concerning what you're terming as the drug cartel problem. That includes why do we have drug cartels? For example, you know, why are people, you know, let's say in Mexico, why are so many people in Mexico or El Salvador or the other places involved in drug trafficking and criminal gang activity, most of which directly or indirectly is connected to drugs? And the reason, you know, one of the main reasons is that economically they're in poverty. They basically have few ways to survive. You know, down in Mexico, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Jamin, I don't think they have a great social welfare system down there. And even worse in Central America. So you have a situation, just like in the city of Chicago, where once the city was deindustrialized, starting in the 1970s, and the factories first moved to the south or to other parts of the country where you didn't have union influence. And then finally, the general outsourcing to other areas of the world, so that the cost of labor was pretty much put down into a level that most people can't really live very well on. So when that happened in Chicago, you had this huge increase in street gang membership. It's totally correlated. And that's because you had all these young men who back in the 1950s or 60s, even though they might be somewhat rebellious when they're teenagers, would be able to go to work in the steel mills, the factories that were all throughout Chicago, which at that time was still a huge industrial city. And it had a lot of bad parts to being an industrial city, the pollution, etc. But basically, you did not have this huge street gang membership. It has grown steadily because of the street gangs are involved in drug trafficking. And the cartel, I don't know which one, but from Mexico, you know, pretty much distributes the drugs in the city of Chicago, where we have a very large Mexican population. But we have to understand that it is the pain, the emotional pain, which comes from constantly living in near poverty without having really much hope of getting anything, you know, improved. And so, yes, the drug cartels are violent, they're brutal, they do not have much of a concern for collateral damage they cause. But I think it's important to kind of recognize that they do take care of a lot of people economically. And that's, you know, again, so what has messed up and, you know, again, Jamin, you would know this probably as well as anybody. You know, once you had the NAFTA agreement, it made it possible. One great example is I don't know whether they're international, but the grain companies, the agriculture industries were able to essentially put many people who were engaged in subsistence farming or maybe making a little surplus in parts of Mexico. They took away their ability to make a living, and then they have to come up across the border and go work as near slave labor in meat packing operations or, you know, out in the fields. And this is part of it. So we do have criminal drug cartels. They're a huge problem. But I think it's important to build on what really causes you to have the criminal drug cartels. And I think what that leads to, maybe not obviously, but I think it's logical, it leads you to the same power structure, which, you know, you can say are these transnational corporations, and the way that they essentially pretty much control most things that are going on in the world. And again, they're concerned with making profits. They do not, you know, all costs to the communities are externalized. You know, we'll pollute, we'll do this, we'll do that, and then, you know, you guys pick up the costs. And I think so when we're talking about these criminal drug cartels down on the Texas-Mexican border, for example, that there be an explanation put together that really connects the dots. Because, you know, one of the things that will happen when you're down there, again, the alt-right community, which is very much against police state operations, at least at this point in time, they will be behind you. You know, Donald Trump himself would say, yeah, we got to stop these drugs coming across the border. So when you get sort of connected with that, then you're going to probably you might have a reaction from other people who are very anti-Trump, et cetera, and would be saying, well, you know, you're giving support to blocking immigration, and this is, you know. So I think that it's an interesting idea, and I think could be implemented, but I think it has to be done very, very carefully and with connecting these various dots, because otherwise it'll get lost in a lot of kind of noise and people misunderstanding what it is you're trying to connect. I'm going to go ahead and go on mute.
Really good points, Dan. I want to welcome and introduce Terry Patton, author of the new book, A New Republic of the Heart, an Ethos for Revolutionaries. So welcome, Terry. And by way of introduction, I also say no one is ever compelled to speak on these video conferences. So
yes, I'm not really
my introduction is by no means.
The conversation that you're having doesn't seem to be focused on topics I have much to say about. So perhaps perhaps you're in the midst of something and I don't need to derail it.
Oh, no. Well, feel free to jump in anytime. And if you want to just kind of hang out and listen in for a bit and then jump in when you feel like it, that's totally fine too. It's a totally open format. But just to kind of give a little bit of context to what Dan was saying. So in the previous hour, we were talking about the imperative to refreeze the Arctic, and the fact that we've got very little time left in which to accomplish that. We're almost out of Arctic ice, and that would lead to catastrophic heating and habitat loss for humanity and other species. And so that led us, and this has been going on for the last several weeks, but that led us to a conversation about what's it going to take to get the attention of humanity and the focus on this problem. And after much trial and error and exploration, where I finally netted out was to expand my movement that I've been leading here in the state of Washington to rid the state of Washington of all criminal drug cartels, to take that movement national and generate massive media attention. Not because that issue necessarily maps perfectly to refreezing the Arctic. At first glance, they seem totally disconnected, but rather because there is a definite pathway to take the massive amount of media attention that would be achieved over this topic and direct it towards saving life on Earth, saving Mother Earth, starting with the very urgent action refreezing the Arctic. And so I'm going to, as soon as I can get it up here, I'm going to show an image that kind of summarizes the overall strategy. But it basically goes like this. You know, we're on this highway to hell right now, which is abrupt climate change, the destruction of the biosphere, the sixth mass extinction that we're in the midst of. And we need to find an off-ramp from this highway to hell. And the off-ramp is a holistic off-ramp. It can be confused as having 3 stages, but really it's 3 facets which must evolve simultaneously, and each of them very, very quickly. And the 3 facets are the eradication of criminal drug cartels, the eradication of all forms of organized crime, including organized crimes against Mother Earth. And so you see how that flow in those topics takes you from something very explosive and very immediate, for which we're going to provoke an international incident on the border between the United States and Mexico in a few weeks, a number of those incidents, right? Because without getting the world's attention, we're going nowhere in a real hurry. And the world just continues on this downward death spiral. And, you know, you've got millions of groups of people all around the world, each with a different focus. But we don't have a central hub for addressing this existential crisis. So that takes us to the topic of, you know, forcing this issue of criminal drug cartels through the kinds of actions we're going to be taking. And let me see if I can.
Jamin, before you put that up there, let me. I want. Okay. I mean, I want to just provide a little more context to this discussion. You know, in the last hour when we were starting to address, you know, the issue of refreezing the Arctic, I brought up the fact that we do not have any place to go to where we can see reliable data. This is a huge problem. So, for example, you know, I brought up the fact that what is the average global temperature at this point in time? Because that has all sorts of implications and consequences for the planet. And what we have going on right now is people saying we've gone up 0.85 centigrade from a baseline that maybe is 1900, 1880s. We have other people saying we've gone up 1.5 or 1.6 degrees from a 1750 baseline. We have these kinds of confusions that are out there, and it makes it very difficult for people to understand what is going on. It is also the case with, you know, the drug problem, you know, which again is a very complex problem where people do not have information, such as, you know, the federal prosecutorial system is very corrupt at this point in time, and it has a conviction rate of 97%, which forces people to cop pleas to things that maybe they did or maybe they didn't do, but there's really no justice in that, and it creates a police state. People don't necessarily know that. It's very important, one way or the other, for people to have access to these data points and the implications that flow from that, and to be able to see the similarities. Now, you know, with radical collective intelligence, and hopefully the platform will facilitate this, where you can connect these things together and see, oh yeah, this is similar to that, and it's the same, you know, set of problems and people perhaps who are involved here, and we need to, you know, we need to direct the socio-political pressure right there, and in ways which can be created as people assimilate the information. But I think we're really short on time. because there's so many negative trends that are going on in the world today, and there's so much ignorance on the part of populations, even highly educated populations. So I do think that these dots need to be connected, and part of that is, you know, again, going to your strategy, Jamin, where you're going to go down to Texas to try to create an incident focused on criminal drug cartels in order to be able to leap from that to these other things. It has to be, those dots need to be connected, and the connections need to be shown in a very, very, a way that the average person who has a certain degree of education or knowledge can assimilate. And because otherwise what I think might happen is it will come down to you get some publicity, and it's going to be focused on, you know, the drug cartels, maybe even the immigration issue might be called in, and there'll be a lot of noise and confusion, and the real thrust of the message will get lost. So I just wanted to throw that out there as sort of a more of a contextual background.
Thank you, Dan. And this is actually a perfect moment for me to show that image, which I now can show. So this kind of shows basically the roadmap, the conceptual roadmap. We are currently on the path of this red arrow down at the bottom, a highway to hell, characterized by increased organized crimes against Mother Earth, from fracking to overfishing to coal-burning power plants, you name it, leading towards the sixth mass extinction, which we're in the middle of, including human extinction. This is the path we're on. And there is so much inertia, momentum on this path, and so many forces of dark forces, including greed and ego and hoarding, that maintain the momentum. This is like a freight train going 200 miles an hour, and there's only one track. Well, what we need to do is find an off-ramp from this highway to hell. And the one that I propose is characterized again by these three facets. It's not that they're sequential. We don't have time for sequential. But it's really three facets of a conversation. The conversation goes like this. We are going to eradicate all criminal drug cartels from the face of the earth as part of a broader initiative to eradicate all forms of organized crime, including organized crimes against Mother Earth. This off-ramp takes us in the direction of a whole world. And it's essentially a two-part process. Stop the harm. These are all about stopping the harm so that we can start the healing. So that's the big picture story. And I just want to show, now that I'm doing screen share, this is from last 4th of July here in Seattle. I'll just play a little clip of this. This is me dressed in my Darth Vader costume. You see the big sign, criminal drug cartels out of the state of Washington. And here's Doctorus in Utopia. We're at the busiest traffic intersection in Northeast Seattle.
Washington, smoking on a joint so fancy. Nobody you meet could ever see the deadly cartels inside you. Hey there, Washington, why do other states just pass you?
Okay, so there I am singing New Washington, which is a takeoff of Georgie Girl. So it's one thing to do this, you know, in quiet, peaceful Seattle, Washington. It's another thing to do this right at the border with Mexico. Then I'm going to do it at multiple borders: Tijuana, El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, Laredo, Tucson, Las Cruces, sorry. This will draw people out. I think this is going to go viral in Mexico. And the part of the reason I'm so confident about that is that we, former Mexican President Vicente Fox and I led a big campaign back in 2013, which I'll just show a little excerpt of now. This became the #1 story in Mexico for 2 days straight when we did the big symposium there. Here we are at the press conference that kicked the whole thing off in Seattle, Washington back in 2013.
and walking away. What remains, spanning many countries. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a unique moment in history. The Berlin Wall of the prohibition of cannabis is weak, and it is crumbling as we speak. And just as happened in Berlin in 1989, the old guards who used to protect the wall of cannabis prohibition are laying down their weapons and walking away.
All right, I'm just gonna play a little bit of when President Fox takes the microphone. When I introduce President Fox, because we've already done something like this, and I will invite President Fox to join me at the border as part of the international incident.
Next, it is my pleasure and profound honor to introduce to you a man who has dedicated his life to transforming his country and our world into a more peaceful, loving, and prosperous planet. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the first freely elected president of Mexico, Señor Presidente.
Congratulations for that position. This state of Washington, has decided to lead a new path, a path to change the paradigm by legalizing medical and social use of cannabis.
All right, I just wanted to play some excerpts. I'll post the link on our video conference here after it's done. But bottom line, this is the kind of thing that gets the world's attention. It just, like I said,
this. I'm glad that you're doing this, and it's going to have some level of impact. And we are also dealing with a great deal of complexity in terms of our cultural and social and political life. I mean, that's why I've written this book, A New Republic of the Heart. If I can share my screen, I can show you the cover of it. It is directly tackling.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Let's see. Am I given right?
I can. Let me walk you through it, Terry. So if you look, it's either on the left or the top or the bottom of your screen, but you'll see a series of icons. One of them is of a green rectangle with a white arrow in it. Okay, the green looks like a monitor. That's screen share. You click on that, and then just click on like share entire screen or whatever the option is, and it should be pretty self-explanatory.
Okay, very good. Okay, so this is the cover of the book. It's an ethos for revolutionaries and a guide to inner work for holistic change. My thesis here, essentially, and you can see this in a little more detail in the table of contents, has to do with the fact that I agree with you, like speaking about crime is entirely relevant because what we have is a crisis of fragmentation. And one of the synonyms for fragmentation is corruption. Integrity is the opposite of corruption. So coherence, wholeness, integrity that's the fundamental nature of our current crisis. To some degree, there are, very much bad actors and so forth, but these are aspects of the human heart. And in a way, this crisis is a fractal matter. There are forces of corruption in every single human heart, in every relationship, in every family, in every organization, in every group of any kind, all the way up to the whole planetary body. And so the there will be certain structural dynamics that are quite challenging that we're going to encounter, because so many people are so resistive to being used by others. So in your campaign to restore integrity and to combat these various forms of criminality, there will be those who have already been doing some good in some way relative to some aspect of this total situation, who will look upon you as someone who's usurping the role of being the master organizer of things. And then you end up with this babble of different voices, all of them to some degree trying to be advocates for one or another form of reform or integrity or wholeness, but who are not speaking with a single voice. And the public sphere right now is a cacophony of divergent voices, amidst which it's very hard for any voice to be heard. And in fact, the competition for attention tends to favor the sensational, and this is why Trump was elected. So we have a crisis in the noosphere that relates to the fact that we all know that the mainstream narrative is not entirely trustworthy. But in the face of that problem, we have many people becoming prey to conspiracy theories. There's no consensus about any common basis of truth that can command our larger body of attention. So you will be heard to a certain degree when you do this, and it will do some good, and I support it. And the systemic dynamics operant in the cultural sphere are not going to allow the bringing together of everyone's attention in a clear, cool, focused way because of these structural dynamics. And therefore, we're going to continue to have to struggle in the midst of this babble of competing voices, this cacophony of partial truths, psychotic hallucinations, absolutely important but unacknowledged facts, partially proven hypotheses that deserve to be examined. But everybody's personal flaws end up being magnified because there's no perfect messenger even for the most evolved messages that are in play. And that's where we're really at. And so there's a way in which we each have to embody wholeness personally and in our relationships with one another, such that we actually are being the change we want to see in the world. And I think that conversation is very hard for us to have because it's a vulnerable and very human conversation. And we're all much better at speaking from our insights and our opinions as if we're very assured. And yet there's a much more vulnerable and human conversation in meeting among people who recognize that every one of us is a work in progress and that every one of us is going to have to evolve in order to embody more of this wholeness, whether or not we turn the whole shooting match around. And in fact, the coming together of our highest intelligence, our whole intelligence, which includes our intuitive intelligence and all our visceral intelligence, as well as our mental intelligence, a total intelligence of the being that I call integral heart intelligence. Our ability to have conversations on that level is a developmental capacity that we're still cultivating. So I think that we're in a challenging situation in which the really fruitful conversations are a shared inquiry, and we're all learning how to engage a shared inquiry. And we're under the conditions of extreme urgency. And to be with all of that at once is a developmental challenge. We all have to be better, fuller, more intelligent, and more integrated human beings, and better able to both speak and listen in new ways. And the exchange of opinions, which is what we're used to, isn't adequate to that challenge.
Brilliant, Terry. My goodness, you're right on target. Spot on. Thank you so much. Wow.
And Terry, I notice in the table of contents, there's a couple of chapters that are referencing tribalism. I think that at this juncture in the world, we know that, kind of the hardwired tribalism that we all have, it appears to be on that level. And it can result in all sorts of really negative actions and outcomes, for the group. We're living it in the United States with Trump right now, because he is somebody who is, aside from, obviously having, I say obviously, having sociopathic or psychopathic traits that this culture nurtures and cultivates, and he happens to represent that aspect of our culture. But, he plays on the tribalistic forces, America, let's make America great again. We're Americans here, and we're a tribe. He's trying to, this very tribalistic sense in a country which is very diverse, probably the most diverse in the world. And so we have tribalism as a huge problem. We have the Chinese tribe versus the Western tribe. We have the Japanese tribe versus the Chinese tribe. We all know that tribalism, whether it's on a religious level or a national level or whatever level, street gang level, it's a huge problem. But here we are at this juncture where it's rational to argue that the planet is imploding. People can debate about whether it's a few years, a few decades, etc., but it's happening. And it gives the opportunity to break down the traditional tribalistic barriers. As I brought up before, we used to have these science fiction movies, where the aliens from outer space are invading Earth, and then everybody comes together, all the countries join together to fight the invasion of the planet. And in a sense, that's what's going on, right? The planet is at stake. Nobody escapes if the average global temperature gets up to a certain level. And therefore, people need to come together, face the fact that ultimately you got to draw down these greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, do something to refreeze the Arctic. It has to be done, and it's going to cost, to do it on the macro level that's necessary, it's going to cost tens of trillions, if not more, of dollars. And resources have to be shifted out of the military, and perhaps the military personnel needs to be shifted into the implementation of whatever interventions are possible. So it's a major transformation that's necessary. And all these tribalistic divisions are so harmful, and everybody knows it. If you ask anybody, if you, kind of draw it out of them a little bit, they'll acknowledge to being tribal.
We can't just decry tribalism. We've been decrying the limiting issues of tribalism for half a century, and we can't talk people out of it. There's a enduring polarity, like breathing in and breathing out, between globalism and nationalism. There are these tribal patterns. I mean, heck, we did over 1 million years of evolving in hunter-gatherer bands in which being a member of your tribe was the essence of your survival. So that's tattooed onto our neurons. We're going to have to work our capacity to, right now, our best intelligence doesn't guide our collective decision-making. And it isn't going to begin guiding our collective decision-making easily. That is a paradigmatic shift of enormous proportions. And all of our interventions can contribute, but we're also dealing with increasing fragmentation simply because our reckoning is creating more and more stress in the system. And to some degree, stress is our biggest enemy. Finding our way so that we can function in a way that isn't fragmented is really hard, individually, just personally. let alone together, so that we can function like we would all like to function together as a source of wisdom and coherence in the collective space. And maybe through this stunt on the border, a certain attention can be focused on certain of these dynamics having to do with corruption in a way that can raise awareness of that. But if you still have internal cultural dynamics that are so sensationalistic and which essentially appeal, this is the problem with democracy, isn't very well suited to deal with our current challenges, simply because every individual's nervous system is easily hijacked based on appealing to hardwired reactive patterns. And that's what Trump has been so skilled at doing. And it's why, to some degree, we're all in an even more heightened crisis. I mean, the 16 months of record high temperatures in a row in 2016 were not enough to get our attention, but having this flaming, bully, liar, sociopath in the White House has begun to fascinate people, but they're just sucked into his reality show and they're not paying attention to more fundamental issues. So the idea that we can suddenly shift this such that wisdom can guide our collective decision-making, we've got to be sobered by that. And I think that we each have to take to heart the fact that this is asking me to become a more profoundly wise, got to be sobered by that. And yes.
Really good stuff. I want to welcome Miles, who just joined, and Michael. I know you want to comment, and so I'll pass the microphone to you in about 1 minute. First, I just want to really thank and honor the comments that you've been making, Terry, as well as the ones that you just made, Dan. Notably, I want to point out, indeed, it is a cacophony. There is just millions of groups talking millions of messages on billions of websites, and all of our emails are inboxes are full, and nobody has time for anything anymore. So we're completely fragmented. And Terry, you talked about the vulnerable human conversations in meeting that need to happen. That's what's happening right here. This is a vulnerable human conversation. We're coming together, we're grappling with reality, we're supporting each other, we're agreeing, we're disagreeing, we're co-creating. And it's a shared inquiry, as you said. I'm just echoing your great words, Terry and Dan. As far as tribalism, what's really fascinating here is we're creating a bifurcation in tribalism. Organized crime versus better, good law-abiding people. But now we're even transforming what does it mean to be, what does crime mean? We're expanding the definition of crime to include organized crimes against Mother Earth and organized crime. And so the bifurcation is organized crime versus good people, right? Which side do you want to be on? And at which point I just need to show this one sign. Michael and I, Michael, who's on the video conference here, joining in from France currently, he and I were at Stanford together doing this demonstration. You see the sign? Death Star that says abrupt climate change, starting to destroy Mother Earth. Which side are you on? It becomes a clean bifurcation between good versus evil. And so what we are effectively doing is we're leveraging this tribalism, which to your very poetic words, Terry, is tattooed on our psyche as human beings. We get to leverage that, and we get to shine a big bright light on this enemy tribe that's coming to kill us and steal our women. I mean, that just gets us right where it counts. I wanted to for those of you who don't know, there's a way to mute. You can mute your microphone. I also want to welcome Stuart Scott, who's joining in from Hawaii. Stuart, my pleasure to introduce you to Terry Patton, if you don't know him already, author of A New Republic, which is of the heart, an ethos for revolutionaries. And there, I just said the R word. Now I'm gonna, but there's a mute button. It could be at the bottom of your screen or the side of your screen. So thank you for using that. I'm gonna go on mute and pass it to Michael, who's been waiting patiently. Michael in the south of France. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that introduction to your book, Terry. And I think that is precisely the topic of this conversation, right? Which is a new story for humanity. And that framing that you're using, which is a very vast one, the scope of it, I think, is precisely, what we need. So before we like zoom way in into these, kind of, political stunts or performing art pieces or protests or whatever, that Jamin's engaging in, to take, however many steps back that we need to take it all in to be able to position that protest in terms of, not only what we're up against, but where we want to go, so that we have a vision for the future. And I just think that going through the table of contents there, listening to your introduction, I think that's where we need to go with this conversation. And one of the parts about the book that I wanted to comment on, of course, I haven't read the book itself, but it's about fragmentation, and kind of taking this historical trajectory where we look back at humanity as very tribalistic, but yet relating more, less as, automatons, less as individual egos, less as whatever, into this, moment in, late capitalism, where fragmentation, the breaking down, the rationalization of various unities into smaller and smaller entities for the sake of efficiencies. There's a dynamic there that definitely is another word for fragmentation. The process of fragmentation, which you pointed out, is also at odds with the opposite of integrity, right? Integration. And so, I would like to see history as one of moving, from a whole world, through a process of fragmentation, because it's inevitable, because we're in it now. And we have a system, of economics, politics, et cetera, which promotes that kind of fragmentation, which is sort of its essence, to then somehow moving beyond that back towards wholeness, but in a way where we're not effacing individual identity, we're not effacing the efficiencies, we're not effacing a lot of things that has brought with it, but that those pieces, I guess, get reintegrated into a greater whole. So, I'm not sure exactly which way your book takes that, but to me, that's the vision of, moving from whole, a whole to parts to whole, in a way where we're able, once again, to experience ourselves as individuals as a part of that integrated whole, which I also take to be the essence of collective intelligence, which is, the platform that we've been working on. And just to respond to sort of further conversation that we were having there with Stuart Scott last week, Stuart, we really took to heart, some of your critiques there, some of the words that we've been using, the messaging, and we've actually jettisoned calling this platform, not that this was the name of the platform, but talking about it as radical collective intelligence, and instead we're just referring it to as Radish Collective Intelligence. Radish being the brand, because we're at radish.org, and collective intelligence being the category that we're promoting. And let those who can see that Radish has shares the same root as the word radical, well, so be it. But we don't need to be out there beating that drum. So anyway, we really took that to heart, brought it into a conversation we were having with the team, and at least to date, that's sort of where we've been landing. So anyway, I'm gonna go on mute and hear what somebody else has to say. Perhaps Miles, since he just joined us. And Miles, it looks like it's spring has finally arrived in Canada.
Hello. Yes, it has. Nice and sunny here, and somebody's just driving by, so a bit of noise in the background. But I just wanted to pop in and jump in onto the conversation and share a couple of quotes with you. Doing a little reading and research as usual, and came up with some interesting things. One thing related to the issue that we have with drug cartels. I'll put my camera on. I'm in such sunlight here that it might be hard for me to see the screen, but something to consider with respect to a new way of looking at the world and how the world is governed. I tuned into this Woodrow Wilson Institute, or Woodrow Wilson Center topic of discussion.
Miles, tilt your camera a little forward so we can see you and not just the siding of your house.
Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you, but can't see you.
Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Soaring.
Miles,
that's my problem with my microphone
there. Yeah, and if you can tilt the camera so that we can see you instead of the siding of your house above you, just tilt it a bit closer to you. That's better. That's better. Much better.
I'm going to go on mute because it seemed to be having some kind of a microphone problem here. So go ahead, guys. I'll pop in a moment. Going on mute.
All right. Welcome, Stuart. Feel free to jump in. Jump in, anyone who has a comment.
Well, I'm going to have to leave here pretty soon, so I think maybe I'll just say a few words before I have to take off. I am very impressed, Jamin. You and I have spent several hours on the phone, so we've talked at depth about some of these issues. I know how profoundly you care and how committed you are to making a difference, and I have the sense that everybody in participating in this call has similarly received your draft notice, and you feel like really mobilized to do what you can to be a part of the way that wholeness reasserts itself during this crisis of fragmentation, and you're trying to think strategically rather than just tactically and holistically. And I really appreciate and I feel a kind of gladness of heart to feel your, we have to endure a lot of, it's beyond cognitive dissonance. It's almost, psychic dissonance. And being social creatures, we partake of the social surround that we're in, and it's one that's committed to denial. And it's very easy for us to just be sucked into an orientation that's full of grief and anger, to find our own joy and trust of being in the midst of this is a real struggle. We're all finding our way as best we can, but we need one another in order to really not be isolated in our horror over the kind of collective sleepwalking into disaster that we're all seeing. So there's a very profound bond that we have because we're endeavoring to pass through an ordeal that is growing us, and somehow we have to come through this in a way that draws us into more resonance and more profound friendship with one another, and an ability to function altruistically on behalf of the health of the whole, and yet the cognitive challenges of meeting the chaotic complexity of our social and cultural world is really daunting. And so I just want to express a sense of appreciation for your heart intention and your intelligence and commitment. Those are not common features, and I appreciate that. I hope you will read my book. I haven't said quite enough about it, but it is an integration of something like 40 years of pretty deep spiritual practice and psychological study. So the inner work of doing this is really my area of special expertise. And I think we are going to be tested in the months and years ahead, and having some really deep sense of how we can grow and actualize our own human potentials and become the wisest and most joyous and most integrated versions of ourselves it's inevitably part of the task of accomplishing the outer work that's going to enable us to be effective. And I hope that we'll all find our way into more and more coherent work together in the time ahead. And I'm appreciating that we're all able to take a little time here to be together in the midst of something so profound that has touched us at the very core.
Beautiful, Terry. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So long, everybody. Right. Sorry I have to take off.
That's all right, Terry. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Great to see you, Terry. See you soon. All right, and on the topic of books, I wanted to introduce a book which Michael and I are currently reading, which just was published this year. The title of the book is Big Mind. It's written by Jeff Mulgan, who's currently at Harvard and is also chief executive of NESTA, the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts. He's a visiting scholar at Harvard's Ash Center. And he has been working on, and the subtext here is how collective intelligence can change our world. So this is a book of the theory upon which Radish is building. We didn't know about the existence of this author or this book until a couple of weeks ago. So anyway, it's just fascinating to see that. I think that'll help really crystallize a lot of the thinking around what's possible in terms of collective intelligence as a platform for co-creating all the solutions that we need, whether they're PR solutions, like doing this public activism that we're doing to get the world's attention and begin a conversation that we think has the potential to lead somewhere really powerful, or solutions for refreezing the Arctic, for geoshading, for cooling the planet by various different means. I really believe collective intelligence is a key part of the answer. It's not the answer, but it's a key part of the answer. It's a platform to support coming up with all the answers that we need. Going on mute. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, just I won't take long here, but again, when Terry was talking about an altruistic thrust, and I think that's something which, again, we talk about being hardwired tribalistic. We're also hardwired to be able to be altruistic, in a sense, sacrifice for the good of the tribe or the community. And we have to know that we're in a system right now, an economic system, which makes it very, very difficult for that hardwired altruism to come to the forefront. And I probably brought it up last week, or I bring it up periodically, but if you do the thought experiment, which really represents the neoliberal incentive system, if somebody goes to you and your wonderful family and they say, I've got $10 million for you to come in on the business deal, it's going to cause environmental destruction. It's going to cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. Do you want to come in on it? And oh, by the way, if you're not interested, we've got thousands and thousands of people who'd be happy to step into it. As long as that's there, there's very few individuals who could say, no, I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm going to stay out of it, not get the money, and I'm not going to let somebody else who'll do it anyway. It's going to happen. So we need to recognize that as human beings, we are almost all of us are vulnerable to these incentives to step in and do something which we know is going to cause damage because we want to get the benefits of the money, the wealth that's being offered. And it's just so clear in a way if you think about it. And therefore, that system, which came into being, you know, in a way, it was sort of a, you know, evolution of economic thought, although it's become quite different than what I think what they refer to as classical economics. But the idea that we're going to have this kind of an incentive system defeats the ability of most people to really be altruistic in terms of their orientation, rather than, you know, the individualistic, selfish, greedy type of orientation that we're all capable of having. And so, you know, I do think that that is something which needs to be, you know, again, dots need to be connected on all of these levels. And the final thing I'm going to say is with Radish collective intelligence, I have great hopes for this platform being capable of being to really aid in the connecting of the dots and the similarities, and out of that being able to construct a new narrative, a narrative that takes account of things that so many little narratives, many of which are tribalistic, cannot possibly take account of. I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
Yeah, Radish collective intelligence by design is all about creating essentially a network of narratives, a network of conversations, each focusing on a different portion or specific topic within the toposphere, the set of all taxonomies that are within, under the grand umbrella of a whole world, which is the objective. And so this network of parallel conversations, which can be cross-linked to each other, all of them transcribed to text, indexed, and then mapped back to the toposphere itself, along with all other artifacts, whether it's the entire database of all academic journal articles, the entire United States patent database and other databases of patents, all of Wikipedia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Map all of this to the toposphere. And that way, any group that's operating, having a conversation on any specific topic or group of topics or portion of the toposphere has immediate programmatic access to all this accumulated stored knowledge, as well as programmatic access to all the other conversations that are happening in parallel that may be on exactly the same topic or on a neighboring topic, with real-time connections of overlap and possible areas of synergy. So these are the synaptic connections of a global mind, of a big mind of collective intelligence, so that we can actually solve our problems rather than just keep spinning our wheels in this cacophony of noise, as Terry so eloquently put it a bit ago on this call. Anyway, that's what I have to say about it. Is we're, you know, and this is a part of it. This is one of those series of conversations, and I'm really happy to see a lot of the usual suspects on our weekly video conference. That gives it continuity. So this is a conversation. This is a series of conversations, each under its own very specific umbrella, the network of which is collective intelligence. So the future is now. We're participating in it. Congratulations. I'm going on mute.
So when will any kind of beta be available to start using? Because, you know, talking about the solution is less useful than using the solution.
Absolutely. So there's a private beta going on now. Well, actually, anyone can apply for it. Let me check the latest iteration of the website and see if it actually has the application form up. We've been building it. Let's check and see. And Michael, if you happen to know, feel free to chime in. Okay. Join Radish community. Join. Okay, it looks like it's there. So you see at the bottom of the home.
You could do a little screen share.
Okay. All right.
I mean.
So yeah, totally. So I'll do that. Thanks, Michael. That's the ticket. So basically, anyone can apply for membership, and but we've got the bar is basically what I talked about previously, referencing the book by a Stanford professor called The No Asshole Rule. We will filter out the assholes, and basically anyone who's there to cause harm rather than participate co-creatively and symbiotically in the co-creation of solutions. So that's where to apply to join Radish. And basically, look, there's no strict qualifications for to be able to join. You just have to tell us a little bit about who you are and why you want to join, and we just if it's a good fit. Basically, if you want to make positive contributions along a conversation towards saving life on Earth, please join. Right, but if you're here just to criticize or say I think it's impossible, that's going to cause more harm than good, I believe. So that's the kind of stuff we want to filter out.
So I just took a look at your screen share and noted at the bottom that it says radical collective intelligence, and not wanting to beat a dead horse, if there was a different R word that could be substituted early on in your meme, the meme you're creating, and I would suggest the R word that kind of came to me in conversation last night from someone else, which is restorative collective intelligence. Kind of that gives because radical doesn't give a direction, and it, as I said last time, it has a baggage of its own, the word, but restorative definitely gives a direction, and it's more useful than a lot of other words that have been used for the direction that we're going. I mean, mitigating, adaptation, restorative. We were trying to restore the Earth. So just a suggestion, you may want to early on, before you have to do a complete rebranding, become known as restorative collective intelligence. I don't know.
No, I like it. In fact, one word that we use a lot is regenerative.
Oh, that's same. Yeah, good idea.
Mm-hmm. So, but we've had a team meeting about it, and we're unanimous in that we're going to drop the word radical.
Okay. I just saw it there, and restorative, regenerative. Yeah. I like restorative better. It's poetic. Regenerative is a little harder. It's a little bit more sawtooth in the the sound of the word. The onomatopoeia of the word is sometimes a big deal. Like the difference between. I'm sorry, the difference between Xbox and Apple. Apple is round. Xbox is like Borg. Sorry.
Yeah, I think restorative is a really good word, actually, because it does emphasize the restoration that is necessary. I mean, we need to bring the greenhouse gases to a level that they were once at. There's so many things that need to be restored to a state, and even though you can't go back in time, you want to be able to make the life on the planet a viable project. And we need so many things to be done. So I think restorative is a good word for using it. I can also use radish or whatever, but I do like what restorative, kind of the connotations that go with it.
Yeah, we have been using regenerative for some time now. I doubt we're going to like actually rebrand it, regenerative or restorative collective intelligence. Right now, we're just going to use Radish collective intelligence, Radish being the brand, like Apple computers or something like that. But whatever the case may be, that certainly hasn't showed up on the website yet, which, as Jamie just said, is in beta, but that'll be happening in short order, I'm sure.
Yeah, but it says at the bottom of the screen share that Jamin showed radical collective intelligence, and just changing that one occurrence to restorative or regenerative or whatever you like kind of completes the meme. And yeah, keep calling yourselves Radish, but when people ask, well, what does Radish stand for, I mean, Radish is like, I'm reminded of the old adage, it was a curse, actually, probably a gypsy curse. May you grow like an onion with your head in the ground and your feet in the air.
Well,
thanks for that, Stuart.
One way of putting it would be collective intelligence. Radish, collective intelligence toward a whole world, right? Something that gives a notion along your core argument, Stuart, which I totally agree with, is give it some direction, right? Say what this is, what it's about. So whether it's regenerative, restorative, or toward the whole world, we'll figure that out, and we will implement that change.
My point, though, is you are creating a meme even with the effort, and people who don't participate or participate lightly will walk away with what? They'll walk away with the highest level symbols, and that symbol of Radish and what it means. Is it radical collective intelligence? Is it restorative collective? Is it anything? But I just think there are a couple of good R words to choose. And I'm beating a dead horse. Sorry. Bye, guys. I mean, I'm around, but.
Gotcha.
By the way, just to explain to everybody, I'm only partially coherent because it's 9:30 a.m. and I was eating breakfast while I was talking. I just got up.
Well, Stuart, you're in good company. The sun does not set on the Radish Empire. We've got Miles in Canada. We've got Michael in the south of France, Dan in Chicago, Alex in Austin, Texas. I'm holding up the left coast here in Seattle, and Stuart's in Hawaii, of course. So you're in good company. And it's what's really exciting here is that a new story for humanity is emerging, and whatever names we put on it, it's about coming together. It's about collective intelligence and a collective search for and discovery of and co-creation of solutions, all manner of solutions, from refreezing the Arctic to transforming our agriculture, to transforming our transportation systems, you name it, our entire set of living arrangements, and perhaps most importantly, our culture. And the new story for humanity becomes, in a way, a foundational pillar of this new culture that we're co-creating. Going on mute.
Yeah, and I think it's just a part of branding. And I'm going to turn it over to Miles here because I know he's been desperately trying to connect with us. When a brand name is rolled out, it's one of those things where at first you're looking for the conceptual basis or the category or whatever. But then as soon as that gets established in the mind, it becomes synonymous with something, right? Well, in our case, what is it going to be synonymous for? I wish Terry was still on, and maybe Jamin has talked to him about this, maybe not. But at least conceptually speaking, we talk about building a teleological taxonomy, meaning there's a telos or an aim or goal that sits atop the taxonomy that directs it. We tend to use the term whole world, which I thought was something Terry would resonate with, which bifurcates out into people and planet. These are false dichotomies, of course, but all dichotomies tend to be. But what sits atop this taxonomy is a whole world, right? And so I think in time, what our goal is, our telos, is for Radish to become synonymous with all of those things, restorative, regenerative, right, whole world, collective intelligence in action, et cetera. So we're hoping that that's what will come to mind at the end of the day. So I think it's good that it's a good course of action, and actually, frankly, one that a path that we were on before, where we weren't using words like radical or something in an overt, explicit way, for the reasons that you so well articulated, Stuart. But anyway, I'm going to turn the mic over there to Miles. Go for it.
Thank you, Mike.
To put you on the spot.
No problem. So hopefully my system's working a little better now. I have a Chromebook and an iPad. It seems the iPad gives me a bit better performance. But what I wanted to talk to in the spirit of transformative and restorative and whole earth is how we've been governing ourselves for the last, who knows, couple thousand years anyway. And what is bringing this to my mind at the moment is I just happened to be listening to a YouTube broadcast from the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington, coincidentally talking about the soaring homicide rates in Mexico, related very much to drug cartels. And the question to pose to you, just as a rhetorical question, if nothing else, but if somebody wants to try to take a stab at it, there was a professor, what was his name? Professor David A. Shirk, professor of political science and international relations. And in this broadcast, he identified what is the most dangerous substance in the world. Anyone hazard a guess?
Money.
Okay, got money for one vote. Anybody have any other suggestions? Okay, I'll
repeat the question. Repeat the question.
What is the most dangerous substance in the world? And the answer he had is testosterone. Testosterone, the male hormone, which, it's all men here. So I think
trick question.
It is a trick question, but it is a substance. And in fact, when you have males, as Daniel was talking about earlier, who are without control or vision or direction, that testosterone leads to a lot of violence and criminal behavior. And I think we need to ask ourselves when it comes to getting to or be restorative in this planet, is to consider what a gentleman from Australia has recently broadcasted on. And he's written a book which I intend to purchase. And the title is escaping me right now, but the gentleman is a scientific journalist from Australia named Julian Cribb. And he says what we need to be looking at is bringing on a new age. And that new age is the age of woman. Because essentially it's been a male-dominated paradigm for, I don't know, quite a while. Anyhow, in, most countries in the world, there were matriarchies in some locations, and the indigenous First Nations people and the Hawaiians had a matriarch. And in those cultures, the determination as to some of the big questions, because men are, we really are fascinated about the hunt. We're fascinated about ideas and things. Moreover, the female personality is more interested in relationships and aesthetics. So we have both hormones in every human being, but as men, we have more testosterone floating around in our system, and that's going to have some profound effects. So if we're not a whole world, if we're not a restorative world, so maybe we do need to restore back to a time when we as men submitted to the authority of the feminine judgment in some of these decisions. And so I put that out to the table for discussion. And then the second thing that I want to share is related to who's in charge, and in particular, who's in charge in the United States, I would ask. And since I'm in Canada, I have a lot less that I can do about it, and I'm not going to try to do anything about it. But here's a couple of quotes I want to share with you. John F. Kennedy to the French ambassador to the United States. The French ambassador was Hervé Alfond. This is going back to 1963. And I didn't know this until just recently, having read The Devil's Chessboard, the rise of Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the rise of the secret government. This book by David Talbot, who's an award-winning New York Times journalist and author. But here's this quote, and this is, according to Alfond, to the French ambassador, John F. Kennedy's disavowal of official U.S. involvement in the coup attempt against Charles de Gaulle. He was the president of France. And what they're talking about, this coup attempt, you might have heard of the novel The Day of the Jackal or the movie Day of the Jackal. What that is about is that there was, the French were involved, they had a colony of Algeria, and the Algerians were tired of being under the yoke of the French, just like the Vietnamese were tired of being under the yoke of the French. And so they started to rebel against the colonial French. And Charles de Gaulle, surprisingly to a lot of people, said, okay, we're getting out. Yeah, the Algerians have a right to their nationhood. Now that turned a lot of the military of the French against Charles de Gaulle. And so there was a coup attempt. Now the premise or the suggestion in the book, The Devil's Chessboard, is that the CIA was contributing to trying to pull down Charles de Gaulle, to get a president in France who would be more attuned to joining NATO, because Charles de Gaulle did not want to join NATO. Charles de Gaulle also wanted to have his own independent nuclear forces. So with respect to a U.S. hegemony, he wasn't really cooperating. So anyway, John F. Kennedy apparently calls up Charles de Gaulle, and regarding this attempt that may have involved CIA involvement, the American president said he could not vouch for his own intelligence agency. Kennedy told Alfond that, quote, the CIA is such a vast and poorly controlled machine that the most unlikely maneuvers might be true. So in other words, John F. Kennedy back then was suggesting that he didn't even have control over the CIA. A second quote that I want to share is with respect to Clinton. President Clinton, in response to a White House reporter, Sarah McClendon, about why he didn't do something about unidentified flying objects disclosure, Clinton replied, quote, Sarah, there's a government inside the government and I don't control it, unquote. So the author of this book, who is a former defense minister in Canada, the Honorable Paul Hellyer, again, a defense minister formerly in Canada, he writes, excuse me, doesn't the commander-in-chief and the person who allegedly has his finger on the nuclear trigger have the right to know what subordinates are doing? And the quote is, again, Sarah McClendon of President Bill Clinton, his reply, February 6, 2008. So I just want to put that up there as to, this restorative intelligence and the conversation about, well, who's in charge, how is power distributed, and does testosterone and do males need to relinquish some of this decision making? Going on mute.
If I could just make a comment on what Miles is bringing up, from the mental health world, when you look at people who are described as being psychotic. You know, they're having auditory hallucinations, and or usually there'll be some delusions that may be built upon the auditory hallucinations. If you actually break it down and look at the themes, there's two that are there almost all of the time. One is the pride-shame axis, you know, where people are concerned with issues of self-esteem, respect, and being disrespected or feeling that they are inadequate, inferior. Whether it's auditory hallucinations, which take the form of, you know, voices, telling the person that they are inferior, or occasionally telling them that they're, you know, wonderful, etc. You know, kind of the grandiose end of the spectrum. But that's what pride, shame, and the other one is predator prey. You know, most of the themes are going to center around the pride, shame, and the predator prey. And when you're talking about male, kind of psychology, men are socialized in many ways to think about whether they are a predator or they're a prey. And particularly with the sociopathic, psychopathic kind of mindset, this is a really important issue. And so, one of the things, you know, if you're talking to somebody, let's say in a therapeutic context, about their, hallucinations or delusions, you do have to, at some point, make it clear to them these themes and how they tend to operate in kind of a universal way. And so even though men are definitely socialized to try to be predatory in the kind of cultures that exist, women also are not free of those themes. And we could say that in the real world, women are victimized by men in a predator-prey fashion. It's big news these days in the media. But women also have these themes and are concerned with it themselves. And when we have, the last thing I'm going to say is just, if you have a situation where there's tremendous inequality in a political system, economic system, country, whatever, everybody's hardwired to want fairness. You know, let's be fair with one another. Let's not be greedy, selfish, hoarding. And the only way that people can get so much for themselves and have so little for others is to have an ideology that makes the people who are being deprived feel that they are entitled to exactly what they get. And so, with men or women, I think it's important for, kind of everybody to understand that they themselves walk around. I mean, if people are honest, how much of the time do you walk around with considerations of how am I doing in terms of pride and shame? How are people looking at me, etc.? Are people after me? Are people trying to harm me? Or maybe I'm going to defend myself, or I'm going to do some harm to them, depending on what a person's identity is. But I think that we have to emphasize, and again, I would hope that restorative collective intelligence, radish collective intelligence, however it's termed, would be able to make these connections on kind of a meta level. so that we're not defeated by all of these issues which get kind of divisive. You know, some of them are tribal, others are based on you know, class, identity, etc. And you know, any one of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, I think, can be motivated and moved in various ways by the cultural matrix that we're in. So I'm going to sign off here.
Man, so many good points are being raised, you know, it really feels to me that we do need a collective brain, a big mind consisting of all of us, each of us, you know, working on whatever specific aspects or topics that we've, you know, that we've naturally gravitated to, that I really don't think any one of us just has a shot at really fully grokking the whole to be able to say, okay, this is the exact course of action. I don't think one person can do it, and I don't think a committee can do it. I really think it's going to take a whole, you know, segment of the world's population. Now that segment doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, 50% of the world's population, right? It could be a fraction of 1%. You know, a friend of mine and I often speculate. Yeah, a friend of mine and I often speculate. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
No, sorry, Jamie. Go ahead.
I mean, a friend and I often speculate about, you know, what if we got the 10,000, you know, smartest people in the world and, you know, put them all in a convention center with, you know, food and bathrooms and showers and everything they need, but basically lock them in and say, look, you can't leave until you come up with the solution. What are we going to do to get out of this mess, right? I imagine coming out of that convention center would be a plan for, you know, geoshading and refreezing the Arctic, plans for cleaning up the oceans, for sequestering carbon, for geoshading to, you know, compensate for the loss in, you know, the global dimming effect from the, you know, the transformation of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But some plan would emerge. And so, you know, it really doesn't take that huge of a percent, you know, I mean, we're talking about, you know, literally one millionth of the human population would be enough to get together and span the various topics in order to come up with the solutions, many of which are obvious, but the implementation path for how to get there is certainly not obvious. And that's why we are playing in some very serious waters in order to get international media attention so that we can actually attract the several thousand or several tens of thousands or whatever, you know, the population size ends up being, that critical mass that it's going to take to really co-create all the solutions that we need, including but not limited to increasingly powerful platforms for restorative collective intelligence, for restoring life on Earth, regenerating life on Earth, right? And getting us toward a place of wholeness. It's the only game in town, so we might as well attract the best people if it's the only game in town. And I mean, what other game is there to play? The game of individual hoarding that just furthers the problem, right? Or a new game. So, you know, we're the new kids on the block. We're going to grab the world's attention and invite them to a new game, which we assert is the only game in town, saving life on Earth. Because without life, what do you got? You got nada. You got nothing. So come join us, you know, and we're continually experimenting with the, you know, the memes and the messaging, the story, the new story for humanity that will get us there on that path. Anyway, going on mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, we don't need 50% of the population, but what we do need is, you know, at least 50% of women being a part of the conversation, right? To go back to something Dan was talking about, and not only women, but of course, you know, essentially other than, you know, white males from North America. And that's a part of, you know, restoring the balance.
I'll just jump in and add as well with respect to the big mind perspective. Is that the title of the book? The Big Mind? Yeah. So just curious, something, I wonder if it talks to this at all, but with respect to the idea of the involvement or the elevating or restoring of the feminine power in the decision making, or the feminine perspective, how collective intelligence can change our world. So that collective has to include the feminine perspective. And to that end, and everything I ever share here is I'm just the vessel or the pipe sharing attributions that belong to other people. But an individual that I listen to is Alice Walker, a poet and author in the United States. She, I believe, wrote the novel that the movie The Color Purple is based on, or that might be the title of her book as well, The Color Purple. And she talks in a YouTube presentation to, I don't know whether it was the Bioneers or some organization. She did a presentation on the topic of democratic motherism. So in other words, a very powerful concept is that democracy in itself is not adequate, because democracy just means we end up being swayed by the rule of the majority, and the majority is not always correct, or we're swayed by the rule of those that are most persuasive or more dynamic, or for whatever reason can overpower the minority. Like democracy and rules of order supposedly try to protect the voice of the minority. But her presentation about democratic motherism brings to the table that there is something internally or eternally sacred about the perspective of a mother. And there's an archetypical mother out there, or maybe what we need to establish is a congress of mothers to whom we would actually go for a final blessing or ruling as to whether a concept is sensible or not. So point in case is, having read the book We Almost Lost Detroit, which is available as a PDF. It details the near meltdown in 1966 of the Fermi nuclear reactor on the outskirts of Detroit. It was a partial meltdown. And again, do most of us know about a near meltdown that could have contaminated all of Detroit? I would suggest not very many of us do. But when I read that, it occurred to me, if mothers were in charge of the final authority as to whether or not you're going to put a nuclear power plant with the potential to kill hundreds of thousands and contaminate a city for essentially almost eternity, they would probably say, no, that makes no sense from our perspective. So I think that's this concept of democratic motherism that Alice Walker talks to is something to consider as well for this restorative intelligence.
Well, I just want to jump in and comment on that, Miles. I really appreciate that. There's a system that is essentially that I know of and have come into contact with, which is the Tioshbaye system of the Lakota First Nation peoples of the Dakotas. And they have a system where there is precisely this council of women. And I don't know if it's all mothers or, but the elders among the group are very respected. And the women meets with no men. It's just all women, and they meet and they make the major decisions, including the decision to go to war. And so, so I traveled with one of the leaders of such a system my auntie Deborah Whiteplume, and I traveled with her and my uncle Alex Whiteplume up to Standing Rock, and we participated in what was going on there, and the decision to do the protests, you know, to cross the river, whatever important decision had to be made, it was the women who had to make those decisions, including the very serious decision to go to war. Because if you leave it up to the men, we're going to think with our testosterone, that most dangerous substance. I'm glad you mentioned that, Miles. And, you know, that's like having a bulldog on a leash, taking the bulldog off the leash and saying, it's up to you, attack whoever the heck you want, I leave it up to you, versus restraining the bulldog. We men are bulldogs who need to be restrained. And the system of the Lakota First Nation achieves that, right? It's not that they never go to war, but if they do, it's because the women have to make that decision. And then the men, you know, jump to it. So anyway, I'm a big believer in that. So welcome women to radish.org. Please join. And, you know, that also brings up the related topic, you know, should all of these meetings be public, right? You know, when the women meet, it's not a public meeting that the men can sit and listen in on, right? It's only available to women. So not all great video conferences need to be public, as this one is. Anyway, but welcome women, and let's definitely bring in the divine feminine, the divine matriarch, and let's have a whole world going on mute.
Well, you know, Miles, when you were reading about John Kennedy, it made me remember back when Kennedy was assassinated. I was a teenager, and I was working at the Quadrangle Club, which is kind of a faculty place at the University of Chicago. And I was working as a waiter. And I remember hearing that, and it affected me in a very profound way. You know, it really made an impact. And I think that most people were very, very affected by it. And for a short period of time in Chicago, the racial divisiveness was not really there. People were able to come together in what was perceived as a national tragedy. And it wasn't long after Kennedy was assassinated that I learned that maybe there was a cover-up of what really happened with the assassination. And I had been socialized, you know, as in the post-World War II era, you know, to believe that the most important thing was to not be a good German and not to participate in, you know, kind of looking the other way when something was happening that shouldn't be happening. And, you know, not that long after that, we kind of spun to all sorts of things going on, the civil rights activity, the Vietnam War, many, many issues kind of came together. And I found it personally very difficult to discover that now I had differences with many of my family members. And I couldn't understand that as a teenager. You know, it was like, why can't you see this? You know, it's all obvious, you know? And you know, I would get into some actually bitter arguments over some of these issues with relatives that I had been very, very close to and kind of looked at as, you know, almost mentors. So, you know, having gone through that period, you know, it just seems to me that when it comes to climate change, you know, it's a very similar kind of thing. You know, if I bring up we're really headed off the cliff and try to explain that to people, I'm met with, you know, again, this great resistance. And when you go back to the 1960s and the, I would say, ultimately successful movement against the Vietnam War, and also the civil rights movement, and then there were all sorts of, you know, peripheral kinds of movements that grew out of that. I mean, it was what we had back then that we do not have now, is that people had knowledge of what was going on in the world. And it just seems really clear to me that today we need to have the same kind of knowledge passed over the different populations that exist in the world. And you know, it's a very fundamental kind of an issue. And John Kennedy, you know, when you know, that famous quotation, you know, where he was going to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And then, you know, kind of the narrative off of that. And once he's decided to put the CIA to rest, then he was put to rest instead. And you know, and from what I've read, it sounds as if at that point in time, the CIA itself produced the conspiracy theory meme, where anything that goes against the official narrative, we're going to call it a conspiracy theory. And after a certain period of time, they became not only sophisticated at using that conspiracy theory meme, but they also became very adept at using disinformation to kind of further that meme. So kind of putting out things which everybody would kind of say, oh, that's obviously probably a conspiracy theory, that makes no sense, to discredit those conspiracy theories which make a lot of sense. And so, again, just bringing it back to restorative or radish collective intelligence. Given the time constraints that we're all under, there's so little time, being able to, again, make these connections, to draw them together in a way that people can assimilate it quickly would be a very, very valuable thing, because we're not going to get it on the nightly news the way we did, you know, say during the Vietnam War, the body bags coming back every night on the mainstream media, and all of the damage that was being done to the populations over in Vietnam, you know, the firebombing, the napalm, et cetera, you know, the Agent Orange. And so to be able to, it just seems like one of the biggest challenges is to get people to make a paradigm shift very quickly, and not to, you know, as philosophy of science, you know, the Thomas Kuhn book, which I think came out in about 1962 or 3, talking about how difficult it was to get people to let go of a scientific paradigm because they're committed to it. Their work is about that paradigm. And, you know, using you know, the expression, we'll get a change when all these individuals have died off. We don't have time for that today. And we need to be able to really have a paradigm shift quickly.
Daniel, I'll just add in with respect to what you're talking about, this paradigm shift, and how do we get people to rally, you know, like they did, as you described, as you remember, as a teen when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It brought the United States together. And there's a gentleman that I've been in contact with and I was just thinking, I will send him a link, or I'll send him the link to this broadcast. His name is Robbie Lepser, and I forget which state he is in, but he's a documentary film producer, and he has a recently released documentary called Power Struggle. And coincidentally, it ties into nuclear power. What was that show that was very popular? My brain is getting fuzzy these days, but where he sells lawnmowers and leaf blowers, and it's more power was the slogan that he would use. Do you remember that show? Anyway, he's a famous comedian down there, but when it comes to more power and testosterone, you got to think there's a connection as to why anybody who would dream up a nuclear power plant had to be male. Because as Arnie Gunderson, who is a former chief engineer of a nuclear power company and actually holds some nuclear safety patent, he says that in a 12 by 12 by 12 box in a nuclear power plant, you have 4 million horsepower. So in other words, 4 million horses running around in that little confined space. And that just, I think, makes it obvious to us just what a genie in the bottle, a deadly genie in the bottle, nuclear power is. Now, back to Robbie Lepser, Leppzer. His documentary Power Struggle is actually about the closing down of the nuclear plant called Vermont Yankee. And if you go to Arnie Gunderson's website, fairwindsenergy.org, and it's Fair Winds Energy Education, there's a great interview of Robbie Lepser with Arnie Gunderson and Maggie Gunderson on a local public TV station in Vermont. Margaret Harrington is the interviewer. Anyway, it's all about shutting down a nuclear power plant, which is one of the topics that we talk about here. And he documented how they did it successfully. So anyway, just wanted to put that onto the table. And again, how do we rally people to these causes? And they're all interconnected, as you said, Daniel. And sorry that Stuart left. I just wanted to say I really appreciate his YouTube channel. So with that, as I said, I'll send Robbie Lepser an invitation to join one of these conversations.
That would be awesome. That would be totally cool. Man, so much good stuff. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, the nuclear power thing is super relevant because that's one of the big goals that I and Guy McPherson are aiming toward achieving, which is the safe shutting down and storage of nuclear power plants and nuclear material, so that in the event that humanity goes extinct, we leave behind a world that at least has a possibility of bouncing back. Whereas if we let the nuclear power plants just, go Fukushima, then we might indeed fry the atmosphere and prevent any life from existing on an atmosphere-free, hot, dry, radioactive rock, which is what we would leave as our legacy. So anyway, that's super relevant to that whole conversation. And we need to have, multiple series focused on shutting down nuclear, just like we've got a series focused on refreezing the Arctic. But my goodness, what an amazing bundle of conversations where this has been today on this video conference, spanning so many facets of, what needs to happen. And the new story that's emerging in my mind, the new story for humanity, is a very small percentage of us, literally 1/1,000,000th, would move the dial. Not only realized that we're in the middle of an existential predicament, but that we actually need to come together if we're going to have any chance of getting out of this. And a bunch of us got together on Radish and, you know, figured out a way to get the world's attention, so that we, you know, and that's where it's sort of like a chicken and egg thing, because, you know, the news story includes this attention grab that we're going to be doing at the southern border of the United States, and you know, that is largely, I would even say mostly, about attracting the right people to Radish and showing them that, you know, yes, we can come together and, you know, figure out this problem. In fact, they'll be invited to Radish. Everyone watching will be invited to Radish. Many will be called, few will be chosen, but everyone will be invited to join Radish and join the conversation. That will be the beginning of this critical mass of collective intelligence, which we need to come up with all the solutions that we need.
Jamin,
sorry. Yeah.
Just like to chime in a bit more with respect to Robbie Lepser and his documentary Power Struggle. It just occurred to me that he's very interested in doing screenings of his documentary. And in fact, that's where I've been in touch with him with respect to the possibility of having him come to Alberta, come to Calgary, and put on screenings of this video, Power Struggle. Although we don't have any nuclear power plants in Alberta, the province that I'm in, nevertheless, the documentary is not just about shutting down a nuclear power plant and how it's so important to do that, but it's also about the exercise of democracy. And it also demonstrates the power of the feminine, because there's a lady who was 95 years old at the time, a few years ago when this documentary was made. Her name is Frances Crowe. 95 years old. She's 98 now. She's been fighting nuclear power, nuclear weapons since right after World War II. She's an amazing woman. And she's featured in this documentary as well as with Arnie and Maggie Gunderson. And, you know, something you might want to consider before you tackle the Mexican drug cartels is, why don't you go with putting on these screenings? You know, you're an expert with the Sierra Club of organizing events, and Robbie Lepser, he's committed to try to attend these screenings at minimal cost. He said to me that he'd be pleased to accept, you know, being billeted at somebody's home if that can save some money, and because he really wants to see the wide distribution of this documentary Power Struggle. So,
I would love to have him. I would love to have him present the film at a Sierra Club dinner, and that way he could, you know, introduce the relevant topics, the relevant characters, his story, the story of the movement, and everyone sit back, and while they're eating their dessert and drinking a cup of coffee, they can watch this beautiful documentary. How cool would that be? And then have a group conversation afterwards, which is something that we've been, you know, implementing at the Sierra Club dinners of late. And no, I think it'd be wonderful if you would like to take the initiative to introduce me to him via email. I'd appreciate that. Awesome, thank you. And then I'll take it from there with the Sierra Club dinners. This is a perfect example of how we're going from conversation to, you know, action, right? Helping to build community and get the message out there through Sierra Club dinners. But the thing is, see, we've been doing this series, the John Muir series of Sierra Club dinners. We've done 2 of them. The third one is coming up in 2 weeks and 2 days on May 24th. And a lot of wonderful conversation is coming out of it, but it's not having the igniting effect, you know, of bringing in lots and lots of people into the conversation. So, and that's, you know, partly my bad for not, you know, following up diligently enough with, you know, what we can. But nonetheless, it's not achieving this boom. You're getting lots of media attention. We got a woman who has a radio program on KQED and writes for New Yorker, and she's a freelancer. She came and interviewed Guy McPherson, also interviewed me, and hopefully something will come of that. But it doesn't have that shock and awe and grab the world's attention by the whats that the criminal drug cartels on the southern border and this movement that I have the privilege to lead are having, or have the potential to have. That's really
think of the power of going to the Canadian border and doing that, because the Canadians are sending down all sorts of paraphernalia.
Yeah, Canadians out of America. No, but anyway, we are going to
blame Canada. Isn't there a song that says to that title, "Blame Canada"?
Well,
they're flooding the market with Canadian beer,
among other atrocities. So,
I just want to jump in at I've got to get going. And, I agree, Jamin, that it's been, a lot of different things have been kind of woven together here. And, I even though it's hard, I am optimistic that something could catch fire. But it does need to happen. There has to, the fire really has to be lit, and we don't have a lot of time. And I think that most people, certainly anybody who's listening into this, or is looking at as Miles put, Stuart Scott, it seems like he has a lot of YouTube videos that focus on climate change issues. Anybody who's kind of tuned in to the potential danger, catastrophe, is probably ready to be mobilized big time. But we just have a kind of a resistance in the general population. And even though this may be even a minority of one opinion, I do think that people have to assimilate the real world fear of what is going to come their way. It's like last week when I kind of mentioned maybe we need a modern remake of A Christmas Carol. That's the kind of narrative where you have somebody who has to reflect on the past, the present, and the future, and what is in store. And from a psychological point of view, we generally have to be able to rehearse in our mind possible outcomes. And so I do hope that the fire is going to get lit. I believe part of what will get it going is people thinking about the very, very unpleasant prospect of human extinction. It's one thing to say it, or to say we're in the sixth mass extinction. But for people to really have to contemplate on an individual level, what does this mean for me and my family and my community? And why is this happening? If there's something that could be done to prevent it, why aren't we doing it? But if I have the mindset that it's not happening, or that we have 100 years to work out all these problems, I'm probably not going to be able to be mobilized. So with that, those are my final words for today. I really enjoyed the conversation. It felt really good, and look forward to seeing everybody next week for another conversation. Take care, guys.
Next week. All right.
Well, should we wrap?
Michael and I have a meeting to get to. So and I need a little break, having been on the last almost 3.5 hours now, as has Michael. Thank you, Michael. And Miles, you've been on good chunk of it. So I'll give you gentlemen the last words, as brief as you want to make them, and then we can wrap up for this week.
Okay, well, yeah, I wasn't actually planning on jumping in, but because I was just a little dragged down from the previous day, but just felt needed to say a few things, like appreciate the opportunity to present these quotes that I did, and as I will commit to follow up with Robbie Lepser and get him connected to you, Jamin, and take that as it may. Looking forward to it. Bye, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Miles. Thank you.
Thanks, Miles. Thank you.
All righty. Okie doke. Well, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all next week on the Social Club at the End of the World. Thank you.